Paternalism is the interference of a state or an individual with another person against their will and defended or motivated by a claim that the person interfered with will be better off or protected from harm. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. In other words, paternalism is how the state can violate your individual liberty and autonomy by keeping you from doing something they deem harmful to your person. I'm here today to argue against legal paternalism, especially when it comes to suicide. I intend to make you understand why suicide is not an issue related to paternalism. In society, paternalism is used to keep people safe, like wearing seatbelts, wearing helmets, or not swimming at the beach without a lifeguard on duty. These are paternalistic laws to keep people from accidentally causing harm to themselves. But what about when a consenting adult knowingly wants to end their own life, even if it means causing harm to themselves? Having the desire to die is an incomprehensible feeling, one that I hope none of us will ever know. Even worse is the loss of your individual liberty when it comes to your choice in ending your life. Why is the fate of our life a governmental notion as opposed to a personal one? First, I will be telling you more about paternalistic laws and what they were made for. Next, we'll talk about if there is legal justification for paternalistic laws and what that entails. Lastly, you will hear why there will always be paternalistic laws in society and why people think they are necessary. For thousands of years, our society has been making laws and rules people must abide by. But what is the history behind these laws? The history of paternalism dates back to the 19th century. The term paternalism first appeared in the 19th century as an implied critique predicated on the inherent value of personal liberty and autonomy. Positions elegantly outlined by Immanuel Kant in 1985 and John Stuart Mill in 1859. Encyclopedia Britannica, Lindsay J. Thompson. When the term paternalism was first used in the 19th century, it did not have the same implications it has today. It was mostly used in the controlling of all aspects of employees' life by their employers. Following the transition to the industrialized era, there was relative silence about paternalism. The term wasn't reintroduced until the 20th century in the context of criminal law. The new paternalism of the 20th century became social policies aimed at the poor that attempted to reduce poverty and other social problems by directive and supervisory means. Encyclopedia Britannica, Lindsay J. Thompson. In 1972, philosopher Gerald Dworkin identified paternalism as the interference with a person's liberty of action justified by reasons referring exclusively to the welfare, good, happiness, needs, interests, or values of the person being coerced. Encyclopedia Britannica. These days, paternalistic laws are used to interfere, override, or restrict someone's freedom for their own good, for what is believed to be their own good or safety. Laws that are based on paternalism include things like banning certain harmful drugs, requiring motorists to wear seatbelts or helmets, making education mandatory, and all forms of suicide. Our government usually restricts things that they decide are for our own good. But shouldn't our individual freedom decide what is for our own good? Physicians frequently face their own form of paternalistic decisions when dealing with patients. They must make decisions for their patients that are sometimes in their best interest but against their own will, like saving the life of someone who has attempted suicide or committing a patient to a mental institution because they have been deemed a danger to themselves or a danger to society. Some would say that the only legal justification for paternalism is that in the case of doctors who need to decide what is the best care for their patients. But how do we determine what doctors have a patient's best interest? John Stuart Mill's anti-paternalistic principles states that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his or her will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. Extended Anti-Paternalism Journal of Medical Ethics. According to Moses' justification for paternalistic laws, the only justification there is regarding legal paternalism is to intervene if it will prevent the harm to others. In cases that a suicidal person wants to commit suicide, the only reason to stop that person should be in an instance where their suicide causes imminent danger to others nearby. How many people do you know that would stand by and let an individual harm themselves? Not many, I suppose. This is mainly because our government has convinced us that self-harm is bad. Paternalistic suicide intervention is when a person or facility physically intervenes in choices you make for yourself as an individual. This should not be allowed, as it is a violation of a person's individual liberty. While some may believe that intervening is necessary, others may think that a person has rights to make their own choices. Paternalistic policies are often controversial, but as controversial as they may seem, many governments are called upon to instate these laws. Governments should not be responsible for saving people from themselves. Government paternalism gets to decide whether or not the state should control citizen decision making in positive ways, and if so, how will it be done? According to the dominant view, paternalism is wrong when it interferes with a person's autonomy. U.S. National Library of Medicine. I imagine that some laws must come to terms because there are people pushing for them. Groups that campaign for certain laws are very common, like groups of suicide law survivors. One group, the Alliance of Hope, is a group that campaigns for suicide awareness and laws. While I sympathize with their loss, self-autonomy is 100% one's own self-governing. There will always be people out there who grieve after a loved one's suicide or an accident they feel could have been protected by laws. Therefore, I believe there will always be someone pushing for paternalistic laws. To intervene or not intervene, that is a question. When is it okay and when must one step aside? This is a decision many governments, doctors, and individuals make every day. As we know, mental illness is something that is very real, that a lot of our society has struggled with in the past and struggles with till this day. According to the American Journal of Psychiatry, psychological autopsies studies in high-income countries have consistently found that at least 90% of persons who die of suicide are suffering from a mental disorder at the time of their death. Michael R. Phillips, MD. So as you see, suicide and mental illness coincide very much. But a person suffering needs to ask for help. One cannot just assume the person needs help, just as someone suffering from drug addiction. The University of Rochester recommends people asking for help early on because it makes a big difference. Unfortunately, many people who are suffering from mental illness do not ask for help because of a stigma that follows. Stigmas can lead to discrimination. Discrimination may be obvious and direct, such as someone making a negative remark about your mental illness and or treatment. Mayo Clinic. Because of these stigmas, many people suffer in silence and they do not get the help they need. This is how we see mental illness causing suicide. So if our society does not agree with paternalistic laws that help people help themselves, then maybe we should help our community by getting rid of this stigma that people suffering from mental illness, get rid of the stigma for people suffering from mental illness so that they can get the help they need. In return, maybe we would not have so many suicides that people need to intervene on.